She continues to work with others to press all levels of government to build publicly managed and publicly funded childcare systems for the benefit of children, parents, and those who work in childcare, a system that will contribute to greater economic security and economic growth for all in Canada. Morna serves on the federal government's expert panel on early learning and childcare data and research, and was recently appointed to serve on the Government of Canada's Task Force on Women in the Economy. So welcome, thank you so much for joining us, Morna, and I'm so excited for this presentation.
Thank you so much, Georgia. Thanks so much for the invitation, and hello, Saskatchewan. It's so great to be here with you. I'm joining you. I'm very grateful to be joining you from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. It's with such gratitude that I live on this land. Beautiful land. My home is next to the Ottawa River, which has played such an important role in the history of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I'm reminded of this every evening when I take my COVID walk. Getting away from it, I walk by the river and take time to appreciate all those who have walked the same paths before me and many others. I also wanted to just start by expressing my gratitude to all of you. You are early childhood educators. You have the most important job that I can imagine. I owe so much to the early childhood educators who have been in my life, who helped me care and parent for my children, and who are now caring for my 4-year-old granddaughter, who's in a licensed childcare program just down the street from where I live. And my twins, of course, are on a wait list for infant care. My daughter-in-law has just ended her maternity leave, parental leave. She's had to return to work a week ago. And my son, I'm very proud to say, is now on his parental leave and will be looking after the children for the next 9 months. But then we're all going to be desperate for a space in a toddler program, because by then they'll be about 18 months. So in Ottawa, where I live, that means they're old enough to enter into a toddler program. Here where I live, there is almost no licensed childcare for infants. There's a bit more, but not enough for toddlers. And a bit more, but still not enough for preschool age children. And of course, like most parts of the country, it's extremely expensive. And of course, would be more expensive for parents if early childhood educators were getting the compensation they so deserve, but they're not. So I think we should always remember in every conversation when we talk about problems in childcare and the childcare center, that yes, it's extremely difficult to access. Yes, it's extremely difficult for families, extremely expensive for them to avail themselves of regulated childcare. But we must always remember that it is being subsidized by early childhood educators through their compensation and through their very difficult working conditions. And I guess I want to express gratitude and recognition, especially now, because your job is difficult at the best of times, and we are going through the worst of times. And I can imagine that being in programs, looking after children in the middle of this pandemic, and now the third wave of the pandemic, is frightening for you yourselves, for your family, and of course for the children who you're caring for, and providing, rich learning environments for. So thank you for that. I don't think that enough appreciation can ever be expressed and shown to you for the work that you do. So Georgia has asked me to speak a little bit about what's happening with respect to early childhood education, early learning and childcare policy at the federal level. In other words, what is the government of Canada doing to make the situation for early childhood educators better and for others who work in the childcare system? And what is the federal government doing to address the crisis in childcare, the crisis of access, of inclusion, of culturally safe programs, a crisis that has really been going on now for 50 years. And it's been unrelenting. So the good news is that the federal government is going to table its first budget since the last federal election in 2019, and its first budget since the onset of the pandemic on Monday around 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And we anticipate that the budget will include a significant long-term spending commitment for early learning and childcare. And we are expecting the government to make good on its promise to put in place what's required at a federal level to start building a truly universal, high quality, affordable, inclusive early learning and childcare system. Everything points to that. The Liberals Party, Federal Liberal Party, had a convention, as some of you may know, maybe you followed it. There was a conversation during that convention between Ken Dryden, a former Liberal minister who was responsible for the Department of Social Development back in 2004. And he had been mandated by the Prime Minister of the time, Paul Martin, to start building a system of early learning and childcare. So he, at this Liberal convention, had a conversation that was, that you can watch. It's really an interesting conversation on YouTube with the Minister of Finance, the current Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, about childcare. And Ken Dryden, the former minister, talked about his attempts back in 2004 to start building a system. And Chrystia Freeland, of course, started hinting about what's to come in Monday's budget, repeating what she had already hinted in the economic statement that she delivered a few months ago now, which echoed what was in the throne speech back in September. And that was that the federal government believes that it's absolutely essential to Canada's economic recovery coming out of the pandemic to ensure that parents with young children, and particularly mothers with young children, have access to childcare so that they can in turn have access to the paid labor force. And it's particularly critical that mothers with young children have those access, have available to them the childcare bridge to paid employment. Because what's happened during the pandemic has been a forced mass exodus from the paid labor force by women, and particularly women with young children. And they are not going to get back into the paid labor force unless there's affordable childcare to help them along the way. And emphasize affordable because, of course, the pandemic has hurt the incomes of households so dramatically. And of course, the impact of the pandemic has not been equitable in terms of income and in terms of women being forced out of the paid labor force. That when you look at which women have been forced out, it's mostly, or they're in much greater majority, women of color, Indigenous women, women with disabilities, and other women who already are suffering low income for a whole variety of reasons. So it's interesting that it's really the economy that is driving the federal government now to take action. And one of the things that we're going to have to be very, very vigilant about is that the economy not be the only driver when it comes to building a system of early learning and childcare. We have always said that at the center of childcare is the child and the well-being of the child. And next to the child is the early childhood educator and all the other staff who support the child's early learning and care. And then, of course, there's the family, the child's family, both the close family and the extended family are all impacted. And what we need is an early learning and childcare system that addresses all of those, not just the economy. So this isn't and can't be just about the economy. It has to be about children, and it has to be about you. So why the emphasis on building a system of early learning and childcare? Well, because we don't have one. When it comes to childcare, and Saskatchewan is not that different than anywhere else in the country, when it comes to childcare, it really has been left to individuals to solve. So the very existence of childcare program is owed primarily to individuals or groups of individuals who have come together to form organizations, nonprofit organizations, in some cases, for-profit organizations. But it really has not been government that has put in place childcare programs. Government has regulated childcare, has increasingly regulated it over time. It has provided some public funding for childcare, but really it's still very much seen as the responsibility of somebody other than government. And that's what we need to change. And so what we've been advocating for is a publicly funded and publicly managed system of early learning and childcare. And what we mean by that specifically is that we want
the second one. Now this is
what we want is for childcare to be funded, the services, the childcare services and the programs to be fully funded by government using public revenues. And that it no longer, the childcare no longer be dependent on parent fees to be able for operators to survive. And that is only by funding the services, using public funds to fund the services, that we can actually start to see the costs to parents start to go down and become affordable without affecting and lowering the compensation of those who work in childcare. And it's also the only way to ensure that the quality of childcare programs improves. It's also the only way to make sure that we have childcare programs where they're needed. Government really has to get involved in the planning of where childcare should be put into place, and also make sure that there is enough of it where it's needed to serve the communities. And it's also the responsibility of government to make sure that these programs are inclusive of all children, regardless of the economic and social status of the children and the families and their families. So that's why we've called for a publicly funded and publicly managed system of early learning and childcare. We have also said that an important part of maintaining high quality programs is to ensure that the programs are delivered in a not-for-profit basis. And that becomes particularly important if they're funded publicly, because public funding comes from us. Public funds come from the taxes that we pay. And it's important that when we pay money to government in the form of taxes, that those public funds are not then used for some to make profit. Especially, all that money should actually go into funding high quality services, not profit. So that's why we've also always advocated for a not-for-profit system. One of the reasons we want the federal government to be engaged in this, there are actually two major reasons. One is publicly funding a system of early learning and childcare is going to cost a lot of money. And it's the federal government that has what we call the greatest fiscal capacity. Because the federal government receives tax revenue from all those who pay taxes, not just the taxes in one province or another, but the taxes from from people who live in every province and every territory, they just have more capacity to fund the kind of system we're talking about. The other reason the federal government is important is because we want to make sure that everybody who lives in Canada has equal access and to high quality and inclusive childcare. And it's only the central government that can make sure that that happens. Otherwise, if it's only a provincial responsibility, you can end up with provinces who have a lot of money being able to pay for higher quality than provinces that don't have as much money, maybe because their populations are smaller or because their tax base isn't as good. And also, when you have the federal government involved, you're not as great as risk to the sort of boom and busts that often provincial economies face, the boom and bust cycles, which I think in Saskatchewan you probably know only too well. So those are some of the main reasons we want the federal government. But another reason we want the federal government to be involved is because there has been too much resistance in many provinces to actually building the kind of system we want. And if the federal government says to the provinces, we have a lot of money that we're willing to spend on early learning and childcare, but only if you build a comprehensive, high quality, affordable system that actually ensures that is funded sufficiently so that educators and those who work in childcare are properly and fairly compensated, then the provinces will be hard pressed to say no. So the federal government has what we call a spending power, and they can use the spending power to try to make change that has not been possible in every province, the 10 provinces and the 3 territories all at once. Like, we've had some provinces that have made some progress on some things. We've had other provinces that have made some progress on other things. But then we've also had situations where provinces move 3 steps forward and then sometimes 4 steps back, and then another 2 steps forward and another step back. And so what we want is really a system put into place where it's more and more difficult for people to start withdrawing from it, and particularly provincial governments to start withdrawing. That's important too, because if you think about, we have 10 provinces and 3 territories and a federal government. That's a lot of elections and changes of government that can happen. So that's a lot of steps forward and back that can be taken. And if you have a federal government, we have a system that's less likely to happen. So I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions about what we might see in the budget, or what your hopes will be. And then I can talk a little bit more what we think would be the next steps after the budget, and why advocacy is going to be so important in especially in the next months, but probably the next few years ahead. I know Shelley's got Shelley's iPhone has her hand up, but I don't know, that's been on from the beginning. I don't know if that was Georgia. Do you want to see if anybody has any questions?
Yes, absolutely. We'll just open it up, and you're right, Shelley's hand is up. So Shelley, if you have a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself. Maybe it was just an accident. So what I'll do,
she has her hand up.
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll just lower her hand, and if she does have a question, then we can call on her again. Does anybody else in the audience, the virtual audience, have any questions or comments, concerns? Oh, Angie has a question. She typed it in. Let's see what it says. Is there an announcement that there will be steps towards a system? How many years do you think it will take to get where we need to be?
That's complicated. Not an easy answer. It's going to take a while. It's a huge challenge to go from what we have now to where we want to be, as I'm sure you know. And it's particularly been made difficult by the pandemic. So one of what we've asked of the federal government in this budget is to address immediately and to put in place what we call front-end dollars, like immediate recovery funds. We've asked for $2 billion be earmarked to essentially put in place a rescue and recovery plan for the sector across the country. Some parts of the childcare sector and the childcare sector in some parts of the country have done better than others. What we know is where the childcare sector has done better, has been able to get through the pandemic sort of, in better shape than others, is where governments actually stepped in and provided special funding, direct operational funding to services, especially to make up for lost parent fees. So what we've said is we want the federal government to give $2 billion, earmark $2 billion for recovery, and that go into providing direct operational funding to regulated programs, and that money be used not just to make the facilities and the programs safe as the pandemic continues, but also to put in place some immediate measures to try to retain staff, because we know that a lot of programs have lost staff through the pandemic and are having trouble getting staff back, qualified staff back. And we also want some relief to be given immediately on the fees, because one of the reasons that a number of programs are underfunded right now is because enrollment is down, parent revenue has dropped, and so we need some public money to help with that. We've also said that we want, right now, the 2017 federal budget will be allocating for 21-22, the fiscal year, about $550 million, which is, most of it is being transferred to the province, governed by what's known as the bilateral agreements between the federal and the provincial government. We want, in addition to the $2 billion recovery fund, in addition to the $550 million that's already in there, that was allocated in the 2017 federal budget, we want another $2 billion. Also, in the economic statement, the federal government announced that they were going to put $420 million to address some of the workforce challenges in this sector. So we want that money too. So for the next year, we want $5 billion. And then we want that money to increase each year by another $2 billion. So in 22-23, it would be $7 billion. In 23-24, another, it would go to $9 billion and so forth. Now, the reason I'll ask for that is that we estimate that it's probably going to take a decade before there is enough, not just enough money ramped up to be able to fund a universal system, but it's going to take that long to build the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure that might be needed to be able to accommodate the many more programs, but it's also going to take tens of thousands of more early childhood educators. And it's going to take that long to be able to bring people, we train people, educate people, and then bring them into the field and to keep them. So, but the honestly, we don't know exactly how long it will take, because there are so many factors that play into that. Like, how much money does it take? Well, it depends on wages and compensation, how much money it's going to take. It depends on what approaches governments use to actually build the system. If they allow and fund for-profit providers to expand as part of this system, then a lot of that money is going to end up getting drained, you know, for profit, which is why we think it really all expansion has to be in the not-for-profit system. And also it depends to some extent what the demand is going to be. And all we can do on that is look at other jurisdictions, other countries, and we can also look at Quebec. But we know, for example, in Norway, when Norway is now moved to a pretty much fully universal system, which is, you know, so it's readily available, it's accessible, it's a right of every child to access early learning and care from birth. And the uptake for under 3 years is I think it's 93% of children under the age of 3, families of children under the age of 3, like 93% of those children, their families have said they want it. And for 3 to 5, it's closer to 97. It's almost 100%. So it's going to have to be a large system if we get that kind of interest and uptake. And I think we're going to have to count on that being the case. So at least 10 years, possibly longer. A long answer to a short question.
A long answer, and like you said, complicated. So there's Angie just has a follow-up question to that, and then I think Lindsay had her hand raised, and so we'll come back to Lindsay after. But Angie was just wondering if there will be something in place prior to another federal election, so we won't end up being crushed again like we did in 2006. Sorry.
Well, we may have another federal election immediately after the budget is tabled. So we may not have much except for a promise, or I guess you could say the budget will then turn into an election platform. And what we'll have is an election, and probably childcare will figure very prominently in the election. And I think even if the election, the next election, federal election, doesn't happen right after the budget, it's going to happen before we're too far advanced in developing a system, I'm afraid. And that concern is understandable because we've been there many times federally and also provincially, where we've had a government committed, or says that it's committed, has made the promise, and then ends up being defeated. That's what happened in 2006 federally. In Ontario, the last Ontario election, it happened. And, you know, but of course, it's not only been elections that have gotten in our way of getting a universal childcare system. It comes to, there's been a lack of political will, I think is a bigger consideration than the fact that there's an election. And I think that's, again, where advocacy comes in. because we will, I think, I think we can be almost guaranteed that we're going to have an election before we have universal childcare. And it's up to us to make sure that the political parties stay fixed on their promise. And it's not just a Liberal promise. The NDP has also promised that it would support the development of an early learning and childcare system. And the Green Party has done the same. The one party that has not, that continues to advocate for a tax credit approach, like give more money to parents rather than put more money into the services, is the Conservative Party. Although it's interesting that the Conservatives have not spoken out very strongly in any way to the promises that were made in the throne speech or in the economic statement with respect to childcare. So I think even the federal Conservative Party realized that this is a big solution to the economic problems that whoever is elected is going to have to address.
Thank you so much. Lindsay, did you still have a question? Lindsay Robinette?
Hi, Morna. Actually, it was very similar to what Angie was talking about. It was just that's my biggest concern, is that we have such a big, bright future possibly that we're looking at, and just the thought of it being dismantled again, or being just taken right out from underneath us. And I think that's our biggest worry here. So, anyways, but thank you. We've already answered it. So,
I totally share that concern. Although I have to say that I'm not losing as much sleep over it as one would think, in part because I think we are in such a different place than we were in 2006, in the sense that what the pandemic has done is made it so clear, so overwhelmingly clear, that childcare is essential, and in so many different ways, and that you can't actually have an essential service that governments aren't stepping up to help fund and organize. Like, that's not how we do public education. It's not how we do healthcare. And you just have to look. I mean, of course, schools have closed, programs have closed. I'm not saying that the schools and the public education have not struggled through the pandemic, and that school-age children have not had a hard time, and teachers too. But the public education system is not fragile the way the childcare sector is. It just, we don't have schools shuttered for good. Whereas in the childcare sector, we've seen the shuttering of programs. And right now, most, or many anyway, are hanging in by their fingernails right now and dependent almost entirely for their survival from the federal wage subsidy program. And that's coming to an end. So I just think that and especially when you have business, you have labor, you have women's organizations, you have anti-poverty organizations, and you have a number of provinces who are saying it has to happen, now is the moment, that even with an election, I think we have enough momentum. If we work through the election and keep the pressure on, I think we will not lose ground.
Perfect, thank you. So we have 2 more questions, so I'll just bring it over to Karen to ask hers, and then I'll read out Lori's question after that, and then maybe we can continue on.
Thank you, Georgia. Hello, Morna. So first of all, I was there with Paul Martin, and I remember, and with Ken Dryden, and it's definitely a different feel than it was back in 2004 and 5. And I think now is the time to. I just had a quick question though. So when those that were meeting with the federal representatives and whatnot, when recommendations were being made and for the dollar amounts and whatnot, was there some assumption or was anticipation that the increase in money each year and the focus on the system, quote unquote, for early learning and care would create more interest in the profession and lead to an improved recruitment and retention would that would be part of the fallout as well, which is why you have kind of that 10-year plan? Is that something that was thought of? Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, it's definitely part of it, but it's not the only part of it. So definitely money plays a big part, right? You have to have enough public funding to actually build a system. But a lot of attention is going to have to be paid specifically to the workforce challenges, and the ones that you raise in particular, Karen, recruitment and retention. And a big part, we know from studies, is that a big problem around recruitment and retention is compensation, the very low compensation. But it's not the only one. It's not the only one. There are also a number of other workforce challenges. So for example, access to, I guess it would be sort of the things that often motivate people to stay in a profession. One is just recognizing that it is a profession, and that it's sort of, you know, the shorthand is respect. And there are a lot of things that go into that. Compensation is huge, not just wages, but benefit plans, pension plans, you know, the things that most professionals expect, right? It's proper compensation, but they also need to be seen that early childhood educators in particular, but not just the educators on the floor. This is true for those, you know, who are administrating the programs, those who are providing food services and doing other really important work as part of the early, you know, the early education of children, that they, you know, they need compensation. They also need to be compensated for the work, for example, that they're not doing on the floor. They need time, you know, they need professional development, opportunities for ongoing, continuous professional development, because, you know, like all professions, things change. There's, you know, new things are learned all the time about early childhood and children development, inclusion. And so there has to be, all of those factors go into retaining. People have to feel good about working in the sector. There also has to be some mobility, I think, you know, within that. There is a sense that there's sort of nowhere to go and there's no recognition. But also, there's not really any, again, it sort of goes back to compensation, but there's not really incentives, certainly not any monetary incentives to go into to have further professional development, right? Because, you know, you just don't feel like you're getting anywhere. What's the point, right? And also, it becomes a vicious circle, but because a number of programs have had to actually rely on staff who don't meet, who aren't qualified early childhood educators. That's created a bit of a problem too, because people say, well, people are working in the field without education, without specialized education. So, and now you want me to get more, and I'm not, you know, so all of those factors. So what we've said is that we need funding, but we also need a workforce strategy. And we need a workforce strategy to be funded through the funding of services, but also in addition to. And that's going to be complicated. Like, what we don't think we're going to see all of those details in the budget. And quite honestly, I just assume not to see all those details in the budget, because the federal government, and I think this is true, unfortunately, for a lot of provincial governments, they have not put in the resources to actually develop the capacity to support the sector. So we need a lot of work on that too. You know, when it comes to public education, you have ministries of education who have spent years developing policies, carrying out research, and slowly building up the public education system to what it is. And it is continuing to improve. I know there's all kinds of problems with the public education system, but when I think about the public education system in most provinces today and compare it to what it was 20 years ago, there's been some major improvements, you know, as new knowledge is accumulated, as new research is done, training, development, the post-secondary programs have improved and so forth and so forth. I mean, just look at the issue of inclusion, you know, and even cultural safety. You know, 10, 15 years ago, nobody was talking about cultural safety. Nobody, right? But now at least they're talking about it. So we need a workforce strategy. And yes, so in part, that's part of our money. But honestly, what we want is to start building a system. We think once we start the system, it will start to grow, and then we can start making arguments for more and more money. And we take that again from jurisdictions. So we don't actually think what we ask for is enough. It was a combination of what is enough to get, you know, to get a framework in place and to get some stuff happening. And is it enough to start building momentum so we can build support? Because the other thing is, if you have a universal system, which we don't have now, you're going to start building universal support for it, much more universal. As long as it's a system that only some can access, it's very difficult for it to get political and popular support. So that's all part of the program. I'm sorry to always take so long in my answers.
No, please don't apologize. This is all such important information, and your expertise and your experience and your knowledge is more than welcome. And so maybe we'll just do one more quick question here, and maybe the next two questions actually will possibly tie into the advocacy portion that you were planning on discussing.
Absolutely.
So one of the questions is, if the case is that there's an election and another political party comes into play, then what can we do to make sure the other parties step up in a bigger way than Harper did in 2006? And then another question that's maybe related as well is, do you have any suggestions on how to be recognized as a profession?
Okay.
So
let me do the second one when I just start talking a little bit more broadly about advocacy. And with respect to suggestions on how to recognize as a profession, well, I think in many respects, those who work in childcare are already doing a lot, but I would suggest that there are a few more things. One is to band together and to support your childcare organizations, your early childhood education organizations. And the other is to use every opportunity you can to explain the work you do to the most people that you can reach outside of your particular programs. And this does relate to advocacy, is that there needs to be a major campaign and effort to make visible the work that you do. It's very reminiscent of what teachers had to do and what nurses had to do before they became recognized as professionals. It's interesting too that it's a predominantly women's field, early childhood education. And that, unfortunately, I think contributes to the view that the work is not professional, that it's caring work that is just part of who and what women are. And, you know, that early learning and care, there's not enough emphasis on the early learning, and there's not enough understanding of the care. And so I just think that's a huge part of it. The other thing is very concretely to make demands around the ingredients to professionalization. So again, demands with respect to proper compensation. I really think that one's value is in part determined by what you're paid, but also what you demand to be paid. And so those are some things. There are other tools that have been used by some professions to be able to get better recognition as professionals, like certainly accreditation, like credentials, and ensuring that those who work in the sector have the highest qualifications that they can and that are needed to do the work. In my own view, I think the sector, as the system develops, we're going to have to look very seriously about increasing the educational requirements for working in the sector. And this is a discussion I think that the early childhood educators and that the workforce need to have in a serious way. I know 30 years ago in the childcare center, I was president of a board of directors in the childcare center, and it was hugely controversial when the government at that time was starting to talk about putting in place educational qualifications, because it meant that a number of the staff in the center that I was responsible for, that I was on the board for, about 3/4 of the staff had to upgrade. And it caused huge tensions, because there was also a feeling among the staff that there was a lack of the recognition of their experience and their value and what their contributions, that somehow they were going to be, that their value increased only by getting more education, and that somehow diminished their experience. These were difficult and long conversations. But now in that same center, the staff have met the standards that are in place, and that has really helped build cohesion among the staff, and they're in a much better position to be able to advocate for the professionalization of the workforce. So those are just some ideas.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Morna. So did you want to chat maybe a little bit about advocacy
Sure.
specifically? Awesome.
Yeah.
And so we might just run a little bit over that 8 p.m. mark. I hope that's okay with everyone. If not, the session is being recorded, so I will be sharing that with the membership and everybody who's been attending as well. So you can always look back if you need.
Well, I will be very, very quick, and then if there are more questions, then we can get to those. So essentially, advocacy, I think, is absolutely essential. As I said, I think it is actually part can be very much part of a movement to be recognized as professionals. And because what advocacy is essentially about is, first of all, to be a good advocate, you have to figure out what is your vision? What is the change that you want to see? And it's always good to have, as advocates, a big vision, because one of the things about advocacy is you can't be very powerful and make change as advocates if you're alone. And one of the ways to inspire others to join is to have a big vision, an inspiring vision. If it's interesting, people think, well, we can't get people to get involved and become advocates if we ask too much. And I actually think in many ways the opposite is true, that one of the ways to engage and excite people about advocating for early learning and childcare is to get them excited about big ideas and about what can be. Like, get them excited about the fact that if we build a system, we could create tens of thousands of really good jobs for women and for others. That if we had a system, the workforce could be fully inclusive. And if we had a system, we could all be working together to improve the quality of early childhood education for kids and for families. And we could provide service and programs to families that they need. And we could be more socially inclusive. We could build equity. It's all part of a bigger vision of a fairer, more just society. And I think actually that gets people more excited than saying, we really want to get you involved because we need to drop our fees. They have to be a bit more affordable. Because as soon as you get that, then you run into problems about, well, affordable for who, and not everybody has access and so forth. So important part of advocacy is to have a big vision. And I want to really encourage you to look at the vision for early learning and childcare that was developed at a big policy conference in 2014 in Winnipeg called Childcare 2020, where we said, you know, we're going to have to get childcare back on the political agenda. 2014, Stephen Harper was still the prime minister. We knew there was going to be a federal election in 2015. And we thought if we're ever going to have childcare, we're going to have to start and make sure that the political parties take this up in the 2015 elections. So we had this big conference and we came through a very exciting vision, Childcare 2020. And somewhere on our website, timeforchildcare.ca, if you use the search function and you look for vision, you'll find the vision 2020. And if you type in the search function video, you'll actually see a 2-minute video, very inspiring video, which sets out our vision in 2 minutes, an animated clip about childcare, what we want to see in childcare. And then to be able to actually get anywhere and make change, you have to bring others, work with others, and you have to have as many diverse voices speaking. And that's the difference that we've seen now, as I said, than we had in 2005, is we have a diversity of voices speaking for childcare that we never had before. So you have to work with others. That's absolutely critical. And then the third thing, it sort of relates to, again, what I said about professionalization. And if you want to be recognized as a profession, you have to build, support your organizations, build cohesion, act together, be with one voice. You have to get organized. And that's essential for advocacy. And I want to tell you, and this is my pitch, that our organization is determined to build advocacy partnerships and networks in every province across Canada. And we started this project in earnest a year ago, and it's really important because responsibility for childcare, we've talked about the federal role, but a lot of decisions, most decisions get made by the provincial government. And if we're going to have success in building a system, the federal government and the provincial governments are going to have to come to some agreements. And the only way that some provincial governments are actually going to agree is if they're pressured by people in their provinces to agree. A national organization is not going to have much impact on the political players in Saskatchewan. The Saskatchewan political players need to hear from those of you in Saskatchewan. And the Saskatchewan government and the federal government has to hear that people in Saskatchewan want this, right? So we're trying to build strong provincial organizations, working with organizations like Georgia's organization, like yours, and Don Giesberg's organization, the Canadian Child Care Federation, to really build large advocacy networks. So we actually got some funding from the federal government for this project. We're developing advocacy tools that can be used. This is going to be particularly important in an election. We'll start developing election tools of how to actually get the message across and convince those with political power to do the right thing. The other reason why you need diverse voices is you need to include in these, what we want to do is include in these partnerships those people who have influence and a say, as well as those from the sector. And it's not just those who believe in childcare right now. We have to go out and organize and convince others who don't believe to join us. So that's essentially what advocacy is: joining with others, making demands of those with political power, and following through and making sure that we are never alone in making those demands, that we have very diverse, broad support, and being organized about it.
That's fantastic. Oops, thank you so much. I appreciate you so much. I have so much to think about. I know I've had the opportunity to meet with you before, and it's just ongoing. It's just a flood of information. So maybe I'll just open up the floor for some questions if anybody has them. I don't see any hands up yet, or any
I
questions.
hope, though, anybody who's interested in joining the advocacy movement will go to our website, timeforchildcare.ca, and sign up for our e-letter. You can also join our organization. It's very cheap. But the most important thing is to sign up for the e-letter and let us know that we can get in contact with you. And especially if you're interested in doing advocacy work over the next months, because even if we get the federal budget to say, even if the federal budget ends up saying what we want it to say, there's going to be a lot of system building to be done to make sure they get it right over the next decade and beyond.
Absolutely. And we look forward to working with all of our members as well in the next little bit, combining those voices and meeting with multiple regional associations and that sort of thing to have that diverse voice and input from everybody, and to continue to move forward and kind of bring those key messages forward and that big, exciting picture. So a couple messages are coming through just thanking you and how much we appreciate everything that you do on a national level, but even on a provincial level, just even meeting with us. This is fantastic. And if we were in person, I would start a standing ovation for you, because you're fantastic. And I really appreciate your time. And I know it's a lot later where you are than it is in Saskatchewan. So thank you for staying up a little later for us.
Oh, that's been a pleasure.
And I will send out certificates to everybody within the week. I will send some information that I've mentioned that I will send out to all participants. I will also link timeforchildcare.ca so everyone can visit that as well. And aside from that, I would like to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I know sometimes you just want to relax in the in the evening, and I think this is really wonderful to see so many faces trying to move the sector forward and just learning how to do that. So thank you all so much, and I hope you all have a really lovely evening. Thank you, Morna.
Bye.
Bye.